The Situation Room went silent when I pulled up the first slide. 12 people around that table, 4 of them generals, 2 deputy secretaries, a CIA station chief who'd been doing this longer than I'd been alive. All of them staring at a 29-year-old Army intelligence captain who spoke fluent Pashto, Dari, and enough Urdu to get by, holding a pointer at a classified satellite image that showed exactly where 18 missing American soldiers were being held. My brother was one of those 18. I had known his grid coordinates for 11 hours before anyone else in that building. 11 hours while the machinery of a crisis had ground through meetings and chains of command and the institutional friction that affects every organization when a high-stakes situation produces more information than the system can process cleanly. 11 hours of me sitting in a secure compartmented information facility 3 floors below this room, running signals intelligence, cross-referencing human reports from 3 different networks I had spent 18 months building, and assembling the most precise targeting package of my career. 47 previous packages in 18 months. This was the one that mattered most. Nobody had called me for it. Nobody coordinates directly with the analyst when the crisis starts. We just push papers, except when we don't, and 18 people come home because of it. I have never told my brother what I document when he visits. Not the comments at Thanksgiving about my desk job. Not the joke at Mom's birthday about how intelligence analysts win wars by updating spreadsheets. Not the time he told his special forces friends at the bar that his sister was basically an Army librarian. Some families argue, some families fight it out openly, get it on the table, resolve it or don't. My family does something different. My family performs. My mother performs warmth. My father performs neutrality. My brother Daniel performs superiority, the quiet condescension of someone who has been in firefights and genuinely believes that because his danger is visible and mine is not, his work is more important. I stopped arguing with him about it 3 years ago. Started writing things down instead, date, location, exact words, not out of resentment, out of preparation. Because when you work in intelligence, you understand something civilians never fully grasp. The most powerful thing in any conflict is information. And I was collecting mine. Daniel and I grew up in the same house in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the kind of military town where everyone's father was either serving, retired, or a contractor. Our dad was Army Special Forces, retired Master Sergeant, the kind of man who measured worth in mission success and physical toughness. He had the bearing of someone who'd spent decades in environments where softness was dangerous. He loved us clearly and completely, but he expressed it through expectation rather than tenderness. He taught us to shoot before we could drive. He had us doing land navigation exercises in the woods behind our neighborhood when other kids were learning to ride bikes. He wasn't cruel about it. He genuinely believed that competence was the highest form of love, that preparing us for hard things was better than protecting us from them. What he hadn't fully worked out, and wouldn't for a long time, was that hard things come in forms other than the physical. Daniel absorbed our father entirely. By the time he was 16, he could navigate by compass in the dark, field strip a rifle in under a minute, and recite the Ranger Creed from memory. He was magnetic, the way physical confidence makes people magnetic, the kind of person who commanded attention in every room without doing anything in particular to earn it. Adults in our neighborhood treated him like a young man who was going somewhere important. His coaches, our neighbors, our father's old teammates, all of them projected futures onto Daniel involving medals and command, and the kind of visible achievement our family understood. And Daniel grew into all of it, because when every system around you is built to confirm a version of yourself, you tend to become it. I was different. I read everything I could find. Languages fascinated me before I had language to explain why. By 14, I was teaching myself Arabic from library books, not because anyone asked me to, not because it served any practical purpose in Fayetteville, North Carolina, but because the structure of it, the way meaning built from root words outward, felt like a system I could understand completely. 3 letters at the core of a word, and from those 3 letters, a whole family of related meanings that revealed how the language thought about the world. Arabic doesn't just describe things. It shows you the conceptual architecture of an entire civilization. I found that extraordinary. My father found it mildly interesting. Daniel found it mostly useless. "What are you going to do with Arabic?" he asked me once, watching me work through vocabulary at the kitchen table. "Talk to terrorists?" I told him I was going to listen to them. He thought that was funny. I wrote that down, not in any formal log then, just in the back of my mind, in the part that was already building the habit of noticing what people revealed when they thought they were being clever. I enlisted at 18, same as Daniel, same as our father. Made it through basic, tested exceptionally well on the Defense Language Aptitude Battery, scored in the 96th percentile, which meant the Army had significant opinions about what I should do with my life that aligned precisely with what I already wanted. Got fast-tracked into the intelligence pipeline at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where I spent 14 months learning the craft of all-source analysis. All-source means exactly what it sounds like. You don't specialize in one intelligence discipline. You learn to synthesize all of them, to take signals intelligence and human intelligence, and imagery intelligence, and open-source reporting and financial intelligence, and weave them into finished products that commanders can actually use to make decisions. It is not a simple skill. It requires the kind of mind that can hold contradictory data points in suspension while looking for the pattern that explains all of them, that can recognize when absence of information is itself information, that can model an adversary's decision-making process well enough to predict what they'll do before they do it. I added Pashto to my Arabic while in training. Added Dari a year later. 3 languages, plus the analytical framework, plus the intelligence community systems and databases and protocols. Got my top-secret clearance, then my SCI access, then access to additional compartmented programs that I'm not going to name here because some things stay classified regardless of how good the story is. By the time I commissioned as a second lieutenant, I had a skill set that was genuinely rare. Female native English speakers who could analyze SIGINT intercepts in Arabic while simultaneously running human source assessments in Pashto were not exactly abundant. My first commanding officer told me during my first officer evaluation that I was one of the most analytically capable officers he'd evaluated in 17 years. He wasn't flattering me. He was making a formal assessment for my personnel file. I noted it, professionally, and went back to work. Made captain ahead of schedule. Got assigned to a forward element supporting operations in eastern Afghanistan, which meant I was living in hardened facilities that took indirect fire, working 90-hour weeks, managing a source network that required constant cultivation and assessment, and producing intelligence products that went directly into mission planning for special operations units. Daniel made first sergeant the same year, which was genuinely impressive, and which he mentioned every time we were in the same room for the following 18 months. 2 high performers in the same family, one kicking doors, one reading the intelligence that told him which doors to kick and why and where the threats were positioned inside them. Guess which one our father bragged about at the VFW? Guess which one got the long, proud handshake at Christmas? Guess which one existed primarily as a supporting detail in the other one's story? The comments accumulated slowly over years, each one small enough to dismiss individually, significant enough together to form a pattern that I tracked with the same methodical attention I applied to intelligence collection. At my first deployment homecoming, Daniel shook my hand and said, "Welcome back. How was the air conditioning?" I'd spent 8 months in a hardened facility in Bagram that took rocket fire 6 times, including once that collapsed part of the roof of the building next door to mine. I had worked inside those attacks, monitoring collection systems and updating threat assessments while rounds were impacting, because the intelligence picture doesn't stop being important just because someone is shooting at the building where you're building it. But because I hadn't been outside the wire with a rifle, because my danger was architectural rather than cinematic, it didn't register as real danger in his framework. I noted it and said nothing. At my promotion ceremony to first lieutenant, he told a family friend that intelligence work was important support work, which sounds positive until you understand that the emphasis on support is doing all the semantic work in that sentence. Support is scaffolding. Support is the thing that makes the real thing possible but isn't the real thing itself. He wasn't saying my work was important. He was saying my work was important in the same way a construction scaffold is important. Useful, but secondary, replaceable, not the building. I noted it and said nothing. When I described a targeting package my team had built that led to the capture of a high-value individual who'd been running IED networks in Kandahar Province, responsible for the deaths of 11 coalition soldiers over 14 months, Daniel nodded politely for approximately 45 seconds and then redirected the conversation to his own recent direct action mission. His story had better pacing. It had the kind of immediate physical texture that combat stories carry, the weight of the rifle, the specific darkness of the building, the moment of contact. My story was a spreadsheet that connected to a database that generated a package that an operator used to plan a mission that resulted in a capture. The chain of causation was too long for dinner table narrative. I noted it and said nothing. At Christmas 2 years ago, when I mentioned the commendation my team had received for a series of intelligence products that had supported successful operations across 3 months, my mother said, "That's wonderful, honey," and then asked Daniel about his team's upcoming assessment. The pivot was automatic. Unconscious, probably. The commendation was abstract. Daniel's assessment was tangible, something with a physical location and a schedule and stakes she could picture. I noted it and said nothing. 3 years of entries. Every comment, every redirect, every time I was the footnote in a story where I should have been a chapter, not because I needed to present the log as evidence someday. Because keeping it accurately was the way I stayed honest with myself about what was actually happening, rather than the warmer, softer version I could have told myself instead. The last conversation before everything changed happened in August at my parents' house, a retirement party for my father's contractor work. Daniel was in the backyard holding court the way he always did at family gatherings, surrounded by his Special Forces teammates and our father's old colleagues, and the gravitational field that combat veterans create at these events, people leaning in to hear the stories, drinks in hand, the universal language of operational achievement moving around the yard, like weather. His story that evening was about a night raid in Helmand that had gone complicated in 3 different ways and been resolved through a combination of tactical adjustment and, if you listen to him tell it, individual excellence under pressure. It was a good story. He told it well. He'd always known how to pace a narrative, when to slow down for detail and when to push through to the next beat. Our father was listening with the specific absorption that he brought to Daniel's stories, the look that meant he was filing it away, that he'd tell this one himself later to people at the VFW who would appreciate it. I was inside helping my mother with the food, which was also a pattern not because anyone assigned me to it, but because being inside with my mother meant not standing in the backyard, watching Daniel occupy the space where my career should also exist, and finding no way to insert myself without it becoming a comparison that went predictably. My mother noticed. She notices everything, always has. "You could go out there," she said quietly, not looking up from the dish she was arranging. "He'd include you." "He'd try," I said. "But there's no natural way to include what I do in that conversation. His work has a narrative shape. Mine is more like a logic problem that took 18 months to solve. You can't tell it around a fire." "You could try." "I tried at Christmas," he redirected in 45 seconds. She was quiet. "I'm not angry about it, Mom. I'm just clear-eyed about it." Being clear-eyed and being okay with it aren't the same thing. She was right. I wasn't entirely okay with it, but I was done needing it to be different before I went back to work. That was August 14th. 12 weeks later, on November 3rd, Daniel's patrol went dark in Nuristan Province. 18 soldiers, 2 vehicles, 1 interpreter. Last communication at 22:17 hours local time. Headed into a valley to assess a reported weapons cache. Nothing after that. No emergency beacon activation, no radio transmission, no visual confirmation from any asset. Just silence. And then the machinery of crisis grinding into motion. I found out at 0340 hours when my secure phone buzzed with a priority message from my unit's watch officer. Not because anyone thought to call the missing patrol leader's sister, but because my team was one of 3 intelligence elements tasked with supporting the search. I read the patrol manifest twice before I trusted what I was seeing. First Sergeant Daniel Cole. 3rd name on the list, my brother. The brother who had shown up at my basic training graduation even though he was on a tight leave schedule, standing in the crowd with his Special Forces patch on his shoulder, proud in the complicated way he rarely showed directly. Who had also, in the years since, systematically reduced my service to a supporting role in the story of his. Both things were simultaneously true. The difficult arithmetic of a sibling relationship stretched across two demanding careers. I sat with that for 90 seconds, which is about how long I can afford in the middle of an intelligence crisis to be a human being before I have to be an analyst. 90 seconds of my hands not quite working right, and my brain doing the calculation no one wants to do, the one where you estimate probability of survival against elapsed time, against known enemy capabilities in the area of operations. The math was not reassuring. 18 soldiers missing in Nuristan Province for 7 hours. Haqqani network active in that corridor. Multiple previous incidents in the region. Then I stopped calculating and opened my analytical systems. Because the alternative to working is not working. And not working means 18 soldiers stay missing longer, including my brother. The valley they'd entered was in my assigned area of analysis. This was not coincidence. My assignment covered eastern Afghanistan. Nuristan Province specifically, because 18 months earlier my commanding officer had matched analyst specializations to geographic areas, and my language skills made eastern Afghanistan a natural fit. What that meant on the morning of November 4th was that I had 18 months of intelligence products on that region sitting in my analytical database, layered and indexed and cross-referenced in ways that took years to build properly. I knew the tribal dynamics, down to which sub-clans maintained working relationships with coalition forces and which had shifted under Haqqani pressure. I knew the insurgent networks, the key nodes and personalities, the communication patterns and the timing rhythms that indicated operational planning. I knew which compounds had been flagged and why. I knew which intelligence gaps remained and where my information was weakest. The first thing I pulled was the SIGINT collection from the past 72 hours. Signals intelligence, for the uninitiated, is what you get when you intercept electronic communications. Radio transmissions, cell phone traffic, satellite communications, anything that moves through the electromagnetic spectrum and can be captured and analyzed. In that region, Haqqani-affiliated networks used a rotating series of frequencies and a relatively primitive but effective communications protocol that I had spent 6 months learning to recognize. The past 72 hours showed unusual traffic on 3 specific frequencies associated with a mid-level commander operating in the northern part of the valley. Not the kind of traffic that indicates routine operations. The kind that indicates something has changed, something is being coordinated, something is worth communicating about urgently enough to risk the exposure that comes from increased radio traffic. The second thing I pulled was a human report filed 6 days earlier by a source I'll call Zafar, which is not his name but gives him a fixed point in this story. Zafar was not a hero. He was a pragmatist, a man who understood which way the pressures in his region were moving and had made a calculated decision that his interests aligned more closely with ours than with the network that had been taxing his village and occasionally executing people who objected. I had cultivated him for 4 months through an established handler, meeting protocols, validation processes, and the patient, careful relationship management that human requires. Zafar's information was reliable because I had tested it. 11 previous reports. 9 confirmed accurate through independent collection. 2 unverifiable, but not contradicted by other sources. His 6-day-old report mentioned a senior commander named Farouk Nazari was planning something significant in the northern part of the valley. He didn't know what. He knew there had been unusual traffic and unusual movement, and that Nazari's men had been active at a compound that had previously been used for storage and occasional overnight stays. The third thing I pulled was imagery from 48 hours prior. Satellite imagery showing vehicle movement near that compound. 3 vehicles in a 12-hour window. For a compound that had previously shown virtually no traffic, 3 vehicles in 12 hours was significant. It had been flagged by the imagery analysts but not actioned because there wasn't enough corroborating evidence to justify a strike or a dedicated surveillance effort. There was now. 3 data streams. SIGINT showing increased coordination traffic. HUMANT indicating planned activity in that area. Imagery showing physical movement consistent with preparation. Individually, each stream told a partial story. Together, they pointed at a compound in the northern valley with a confidence I could calculate. I ran the assessment methodology we used for targeting packages, cross-referenced the source reliability scores, the SIGINT confidence levels, the imagery interpretation certainties, ran scenario analysis on alternative explanations for the collected data, assigned probabilities. When I was done, I had a confidence level of 73% that the missing patrol was being held at that compound. In Eastern Afghanistan intelligence terms, 73% was exceptional. I had produced packages above 60% fewer than a dozen times in 18 months. I worked for 11 hours without stopping. Verified and re-verified the source assessments. Pulled every piece of related intelligence from the database to check for contradicting information. Built a compound layout based on the imagery, marking the likely holding areas, the guard positions as best as I could estimate from vehicle positions and historical pattern of life. Developed 3 approach routes for a rescue element, each one analyzed for cover, concealment, potential contact, and timing relative to the patrol's likely condition. Built a threat assessment for each approach rated by probability of enemy resistance. Wrote the targeting package to the standard the rescue element would need, not the standard of an analyst who wants to show her work, but the standard of operators who need to move fast and need information that is precise and clear and immediately actionable. When I was satisfied it was correct, when I had checked everything a third time and could not find anything I'd missed, I flagged the package for immediate dissemination and copied my commanding officer. Then I waited. 22 minutes. No response. Sent a follow-up. 14 more minutes. Nothing. This is the part of intelligence work that combat soldiers never understand. You can build the most precise, most complete, most actionable intelligence product in the history of the conflict. You can have the answer. You can have the address. And you can wait while the people who are supposed to use it are in meetings, in chains of command, in the institutional friction that affects every organization when a crisis creates information overload and everyone is processing and coordinating and nobody has gotten to the analyst's inbox that contains the specific thing they need. My brother was in that compound. My intelligence said so with 73% confidence. And no one was reading it. I bypassed my direct chain. I called the Deputy G2 directly. He picked up on the second ring, which told me he was awake and already stressed. I identified myself, told him what I had, told him the confidence level, told him the timeline pressure based on Haqqani relocation patterns. He was quiet for 4 seconds, then, "Get to the jock, bring everything." 40 minutes later, I was in the Joint Operations Center, briefing a room that had doubled in size since the patrol went dark. Colonels, lieutenant colonels, special operations liaisons, a CIA representative in civilian clothes who looked like he hadn't slept in 30 hours. I had my analytical package loaded on the classified display system, printed copies of the key products in front of every seat, and the specific, focused energy that comes from knowing you are the person in the room with the information everyone needs. I had briefed rooms like this before, not this large, not with this much at stake, not with my brother on the manifest. But the mechanics were the same. You stand at the front, you present the data clearly, you show your methodology transparently enough that the room can challenge it if they see a flaw. You hold the confidence level honestly, not inflating it for impact and not deflating it to protect yourself from being wrong. You answer questions with exactly as much certainty as the evidence supports, and no more. I walked them through the SIGINT analysis first, because that was the freshest collection and the most directly actionable. Explained the frequency anomaly, the traffic volume increase, the timing correlation with the patrol's disappearance. Then the HUMANT, walking them through Zafar's report and his reliability history, explaining the source validation methodology that gave me confidence his information was genuine rather than planted. Then the imagery, the compound layout, the vehicle movement patterns, the way the 3 data streams converged on a single location. I built the picture methodically, the way my training had taught me, leading the room through the same analytical journey I'd taken, so that by the time I stated the confidence level, they had already felt the weight of the evidence themselves. 73% on this compound as the primary holding location, I said. based on SIGINT volume analysis, human source reporting with a 4-month reliability history, and imagery pattern of life deviation. Alternative explanations for the collected data have been assessed, and none account for all 3 streams simultaneously. I paused. Time is a constraint. Based on Haqqani relocation patterns following capture events in this region, the window for this location to remain valid is 6 to 8 hours from now. After that, probability of relocation increases sharply. The commanding general looked at me for a long moment. How long have you been tracking this network? 18 months, sir. You built this analysis tonight? The synthesis, yes. The underlying intelligence collection had been accumulating for months. Tonight I connected the pieces. How confident are you in the source? 4 months of relationship development, 11 previous reports, 9 confirmed accurate, 2 unverifiable but not contradicted. Established motivation and consistent methodology. I trust him, sir. What's your personal relationship to the patrol? I had anticipated this question. It was the right question to ask. First Sergeant Cole is my brother, sir. The room went still in a different way. Does that affect your assessment? No, sir. It means I checked everything 3 times before I walked in here, and I would stake my analytical reputation on this package. If I had any doubt about the methodology, knowing my brother is in that compound would be the reason I said so, not the reason I suppressed it. The commanding general looked at the Special Operations liaison. Something passed between them in the way senior officers communicate without speaking. Good analysis, Captain. Brief the rescue element. The rescue teams assembled in the operations bay 40 minutes later, while I ran them through the targeting package one more time, directly, standing in front of operators who were about to go into the valley I'd been analyzing for a year and a half. These were not people who asked unnecessary questions. They wanted the compound layout, the likely guard positions, the approach routes, the threat assessment, and the expected location of the personnel. I gave them all of it in 12 minutes, answered 5 questions with direct, precise answers, and watched them move to their aircraft. Then I went back to the JOC and sat in front of my analytical system and monitored the operation in real time. This is also not something most people understand about intelligence support. You don't go home when the teams launch, you stay in contact, you update the threat picture as the operation develops. If new information comes in that changes the assessment, you push it immediately. If the teams encounter something unexpected, you're available to help interpret it. The operation was mine until the personnel were recovered or the operation ended. I had been awake for 27 hours when the teams inserted. I was on my 4th cup of terrible JOC coffee. It didn't matter. The approach went clean. The teams moved on the route I had assessed as lowest probability of contact, and the assessment held. No engagement on approach. The compound appeared exactly as the imagery showed. The northwestern structure, which I had assessed as most likely for personnel holding based on the room layout visible in the imagery and the guard positions observed, was correct. 14 minutes after insertion, the first radio call confirmed survivor contact. 18 soldiers. Multiple injuries, 1 critical with what the medic assessed as internal bleeding, 2 with fractures, several with varying degrees of dehydration and exposure. But alive. All 18 alive. They were moving to the extraction point before the full compound was cleared. The enemy element in the compound, smaller than I had assessed because some had apparently departed earlier in the day, chose not to contest the rescue. Tactical decision by whoever was in command, probably recognizing that the rescue element had information about the compound that argued for withdrawal rather than defense. My brother's voice came over the radio coordinating movement for the injured soldier with internal bleeding, keeping him conscious, directing 2 other soldiers to support his weight during the exfil. His voice was calm and controlled and completely identifiable to me from across 14 years of shared family history. He didn't know I was listening. He didn't know I was the reason they found him in 14 minutes instead of not finding him at all. I sat in the JOC and listened to his voice on the radio and did not cry because there is a time and a place for that, and the JOC is not it. I noted the time in my log, the time the survivor contact was confirmed, the time the personnel were on the extraction aircraft, the time the aircraft cleared the area, Data points in a mission that was now complete. The Pentagon briefing came 3 days later. Not the JOC briefing, the classified one. The formal after-action with the Deputy Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs representatives and the senior officials whose decisions shaped the intelligence community's priorities and resources. I was asked to brief because I had been the analyst of record, the one who had built the package that led to the rescue, and because the operation was being reviewed as a potential model for intelligence-led personnel recovery. How you find missing Americans in hostile territory matters. How you build the analytical networks that make finding them possible in 14 minutes instead of 14 days or not at all. That matters at a policy level, and policy gets made by the people who were in that room. I took the elevator to the correct floor of the Pentagon, walked to the correct room, and presented my credentials to the security officer outside. He checked me against the classified attendee list and let me through. I set up my briefing materials while the room filled. 12 people around that conference table, 4 of them generals, 2 deputy secretaries, a CIA station chief who had more operational experience than my entire chain of command combined, and showed it in the unhurried way she moved through the world. A senior NSA representative who specialized in SIGINT methodology. A Defense Intelligence Agency official I recognized from his photograph in the Intelligence Community Directory. And me, 29 years old, Army captain, holding a pointer at a satellite image of a compound in Nuristan Province that 11 hours of analytical work and 18 months of network building had identified correctly. I had been briefing rooms my entire career. I had never briefed this room. I noticed the size of the table, the number of stars in the room, the weight of what I was about to say to people who would use it to make decisions affecting the entire intelligence community's approach to personnel recovery. I noticed all of it and set it aside and started my first slide. I briefed for 40 minutes. Not the condensed version, the full methodology, source network development, the timeline of Zafar's cultivation and validation, the SIGINT collection architecture that had allowed me to detect the traffic anomaly, the imagery analysis protocol, the synthesis process that had integrated all 3 streams into a confidence assessment. I explained why 73% was significant in that operational environment. I explained the time pressure analysis and why bypassing my direct chain to reach the Deputy G2 was the right decision given the operational window. I was transparent about every judgment call I had made, every place where the evidence was ambiguous, and I had assessed probabilities rather than certainties. Intelligence analysis is not about certainty. It is about giving decision-makers the best possible picture of an uncertain world so they can make informed decisions rather than blind ones. When I finished, the room was quiet in the specific way that happened in the JOC, the way rooms go quiet when the information is better than expected. The deputy secretary looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "Captain, how many actionable intelligence packages has your team produced in the past 18 months? 47 confirmed actionable products, sir. 31 led to direct action. 29 successful outcomes." He wrote something on his notepad. "And prior to this operation, was your work recognized formally?" I paused 1 second before answering. "Unit commendations, sir. Standard evaluation marks. Not formally elevated." "No, sir." He nodded slowly, and I understood that nod. The invisible work problem was not unique to my family. It was structural. Intelligence analysts produce the enabling intelligence for the operations that generate the visible results, and the visible results absorb the recognition, while the enabling work is noted in reports that senior officials read but don't often highlight publicly. The general who captured the high-value target got the press conference. The analyst who spent 14 months building the network that identified his location got a line in an after-action report. This was not a complaint. It was an accurate description of how the system functioned. But it was about to change, at least in my case, because the deputy secretary wrote something else on his notepad, and 6 weeks later I received a letter of commendation that would go into my personnel file and influence every promotion board for the rest of my career. After the briefing, walking back to my section through the long Pentagon corridors, my commanding officer fell into step beside me. "You know what just happened in that room," he said. "Yes, sir." "How are you feeling about it?" "Tired. And like I should call my mother. He smiled. Your methodology is going into the lessons learned system. Your name will be on it. Every analyst in the community who works personnel recovery cases is going to read what you built. That's the point, I said. So the next one doesn't take 11 hours alone in the middle of the night, so someone else builds the network before it's needed, instead of realizing they needed it after it was too late. Daniel's phone call came 2 days after he was back at the forward operating base, cleared medically, debriefed, and off restrictions. I was going through a routine intelligence update when the line rang. He opened with silence. No greeting. Just quiet on the line, which was so unlike him that I waited it out rather than filling the space. I talked to the rescue element leader, he said finally. He told me about the targeting package, told me who built it and where the confidence level came from and why the compound layout was as accurate as it was. Okay, I said. 73%, he said. He told me most packages in that region run 45 to 55. He said 73 was exceptional. He said in his career he hadn't received a package that precise in that operational environment. We had good collection in that area, I said, because that was true. Stop, he said. Stop explaining it away. The collection doesn't mean anything without the analyst who knows what to do with it. The source doesn't mean anything without the 4 months of careful work that made him reliable. The imagery doesn't mean anything without someone who can look at vehicle movement patterns and understand what they indicate. That's yours. All of it. I didn't say anything. He continued, quieter now. I was in that compound for 11 hours. One of my guys had a femur fracture with no pain management. Another one had a head injury that was getting worse while I watched him. We were running out of options and I was doing the math on survival windows and it wasn't going well. He stopped. When he started again, his voice was level, but I could hear what it was costing him to be level. And then the door came in and the rescue element had everything. They had my exact location. They had the layout. They found us in 14 minutes. 14 minutes in a compound in Nuristan Province at night because someone had been building intelligence networks in that valley for a year and a half and spending 11 hours overnight connecting data streams and bypassing chains of command to get the package to the right people in time. I said what was true. I would have done it for any 18 soldiers. I know, he said. That's actually the thing I keep thinking about. You would have done it anyway. You weren't doing it for me specifically. You were doing it because it was the mission and you were the best person in the room to do it. And I've spent years acting like your mission was less real than mine. Less demanding. Less important. Less dangerous. Which, by the way, you're in a forward facility that takes rocket fire, so that was always a stupid thing for me to think. I thought about the log, about the desk job joke and the Army Librarian comment and the Thanksgiving conversation and every family gathering where Daniel's stories took up all the space. I kept a record, I said. Every time you made a comment about my work being less than yours, I have dates and locations and exact words. He absorbed that. Why? Because I work in intelligence. I document things. And because I knew we'd have a version of this conversation someday, and I wanted to be honest with myself about what had actually happened, rather than letting time soften it into something it wasn't. Are you going to use it? No. I don't need to anymore. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to tell people, he said. About what you did. About how you found us. About being wrong for years about what intelligence work actually involves. Because there are people in my community right now who think the same thing I thought, who have sisters doing this work and dismiss it the same way I dismissed yours, and they need to hear it from someone like me, not from a briefing slide. That was the moment that mattered most. More than the Pentagon recognition, more than the commendation letter, more than the lessons learned documentation. My brother, calling from a forward operating base in Afghanistan, saying out loud the things that had been true for 8 years and finally been seen. That was the conversation that mattered most. Not the Pentagon briefing, not the general's commendation, not the after-action documentation that would put my methodology into the lessons learned database for future analysts to build on. It was my brother, calling from a forward operating base in Afghanistan, telling me he had been wrong and was going to tell people so. The formal recognition came 6 weeks later. The commendation letter, the after-action inclusion, and the DIA training conference request, which was the one that meant the most to me professionally. Standing in front of 200 intelligence analysts, walking through the methodology that had produced a 73% confidence level in a region where 45 was typical, explaining the source cultivation process, the SIGINT cross-referencing technique, the imagery analysis protocols I had developed over 18 months. Not as a story about my brother, as a transferable methodology, as a set of tools and approaches that any analyst in that room could adapt to their own area of expertise and operational environment. Because that was the point. Not the rescue, though the rescue was what I cared about most. The rescue saved 18 lives. The methodology, if it was documented and taught and replicated, could save hundreds more over the careers of the analysts sitting in that room. Daniel attended. He'd requested leave from his command specifically to be there, driven 6 hours, sat in the back row of the auditorium in his dress uniform. He didn't tell me in advance. I saw him when the room was filling and felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have immediate words for. My brother, who had spent years explaining why my work didn't count, had taken 6 hours of leave time to watch me teach 200 people how to do it better. The question and answer session went 40 minutes over schedule. The NSA representative from the Pentagon briefing was there and asked a detailed technical question about the SIGINT cross-referencing methodology. The DIA official asked about source validation in denied access environments. A junior analyst from a forward element in Syria asked how to build human networks in tribal societies with high infiltration risk, which was a good and hard question that I spent 8 minutes answering carefully. When it was finally over and the room had cleared, Daniel was still in his seat in the back row. I packed up my materials while the room emptied around him, watching him in my peripheral vision, giving him time to decide what he wanted to say. "You're the most impressive person in this family," he said, when only the two of us were left. "You always have been. I just wasn't paying attention." I thought about the log. 3 years of small entries. The desk job joke at my first deployment homecoming, the Army librarian comment at the bar, the birthday dinner where he'd talked over my attempt to describe a targeting package success. All of it documented, all of it clear in my memory, all of it not actually necessary anymore because the man sitting in the back row of this auditorium had already said everything the log contained. "You paid attention when it counted," I said. "That's what matters." It took me almost dying to get there. Most significant changes do. My promotion to major came 8 months later. Daniel was in the front row. Our parents were there. My father, retired Special Forces Master Sergeant, the man who had raised 2 exceptional military children and understood one of them completely and was finally, at this ceremony, beginning to understand the other. He watched Daniel shake my hand after the ceremony. Watched the way Daniel introduced me to his teammates who had come as a group, not with the slightly deprecating, "my sister who works in intelligence" of previous years, but with, "this is my sister. She's the reason we made it back from Nuristan. Best analyst I've ever seen work." One of Daniel's teammates looked at me afterward. "He's been telling everyone that story," he said. "Anyone who'll listen." "I know," I said. He mentioned. "Deserved," he said simply, and moved on. My father found me later, after the reception had thinned out, the two of us briefly alone near the window. He stood the way he always stood, straight and self-contained, and he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before on his face. Not pride exactly, though there was pride in it. Something more complicated. Reassessment. The look of a person who has held a model of the world for a long time and has just realized the model was incomplete. "I've been telling people about your brother for 20 years, he said. Every deployment, every promotion, every mission he told me about. I made him the story because I understood his story. I knew what it looked like. I knew what it meant when someone kicked doors and came home and got promoted. I didn't know what it meant to do what you do." "I know, Dad. I want to understand it now, properly, not just the version I get from Daniel, though that version changed significantly recently. I want to know what you actually built in that valley." What 18 months of network development actually involves. What synthesizing 3 intelligence streams in 11 hours of overnight work actually requires. I looked at him for a moment. That's classified. He smiled, just slightly. The parts you can tell me, the methodology, the thinking. That I can do, I said, and I did. Over the next year, over family dinners and weekend visits and the kind of gradual conversations that rebuild understanding between people who have been talking past each other for a long time, I explained what intelligence work actually involved. Not the Hollywood version, the real version. The patient source development, the 18-month investment in a single reliable relationship that paid off in one critical 11-hour window. The analytical methodology that allowed 3 incomplete data streams to produce a 73% confidence level. The language skills that meant I could read intercepts directly rather than waiting for translation, saving hours in a situation where hours mattered. My father asked questions, real ones, the kind that showed he was processing rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He started talking about my work at the VFW, which I heard about third hand from one of his old colleagues who reached out to congratulate me on the promotion. Something about the daughter who does intelligence work, who found his son's unit when no one else could, who briefed the Pentagon. Invisible work, made visible. Not because I did anything different, because the right people were finally paying attention. If you're listening to this and something in it resonates, maybe you've spent years doing work that doesn't make good dinner party stories. Work that doesn't produce visible results people can point to and say clearly, that happened because of her. Work that sits behind other people's successes as the invisible enabling structure. I want you to understand something about documentation. Keep the record. Not to build resentment, not to prepare ammunition for the day you're finally recognized. Keep it to stay honest with yourself. Because the systems around us are not designed to track invisible work accurately. They track outcomes. They track the people who are present at the moment of the visible result. They don't always track the 18 months of network building that made the 14-minute rescue possible. You are the only person in a position to keep that record honestly. Write it down. Every intelligence product, every source relationship, every synthesis that produced something useful, every judgment call that held up under pressure. Not because you'll need it as evidence, because on the day someone finally asks what you actually did, you want to be able to tell them precisely. My brother called me an army librarian. He was more right than he knew. Libraries preserve knowledge across time. They make sure what was learned doesn't disappear when the person who learned it moves on. That's what intelligence analysts do for armies. And on November 3rd, at 22:17 hours local time in Nuristan Province, the library I'd spent 18 months building held the answer that brought 18 Americans home in 14 minutes, including the person who'd spent the longest telling me my library didn't matter. Have you ever done invisible work that finally became visible? Do you know what it feels like to be the person in the room who already solved the problem? Leave a comment below. We tell stories like this every day, about expertise and patience and the people whose work holds everything else up without anyone noticing until the moment it has to. If that's the kind of story that matters to you, subscribe and stay with us. The invisible work was always real. It just took the right moment for everyone else to see it. Something I want to add about the aftermath that didn't make it into the main narrative, because it matters to understanding what changed and what didn't. The day after Daniel's rescue, before the Pentagon briefing, before the commendation, before any of the formal recognition, I received an email from an intelligence analyst I'd never met. He was stationed in a different theater, working a different region, and he'd seen the preliminary after-action summary circulating through the intelligence community's internal channels. Not my name, not my methodology, just the broad outlines. Analyst builds 18-month network, synthesizes 3 streams, 73% confidence, successful rescue. He wrote, "Whoever built that package did it the right way. This is how it's supposed to work. I've been trying to explain this to people who think intelligence is just data entry for 2 years. Thank you." He didn't know it was me. He was writing to a concept, to the idea of an analyst who had done the work correctly. I saved that email. It went into the log alongside 3 years of entries about desk job jokes and spreadsheet comments. Not because it balanced them out, because it was a data point from the rest of the world, from someone who understood the work from the inside and knew what it meant when it was done correctly. Sometimes the people who appreciate invisible work most are the other people doing invisible work. They're the ones who know exactly what it takes. I think about that a lot, in the years since. About how many people doing invisible work never get the moment I got, never have the crisis that makes the invisible suddenly visible, never have the brother who finally asks the right question. Most invisible work stays invisible. The analyst who built the network that prevented the attack that never happened doesn't get a story because the story is the absence of a story. The linguist whose translation accuracy in a routine interrogation produced the lead that eventually unwound a network gets a line in a report that no one reads at family gatherings. This is not a complaint about the system. The system works, broadly, it produces results. But it is worth saying clearly that the people doing the invisible work are doing work that matters, that their expertise is real and their courage is real even when it doesn't look like the courage in the stories that get told around fire pits at retirement parties. My brother figured that out in a compound in Nuristan Province at 2 a.m. Most people figure it out more slowly, or not at all. I got lucky in the specific terrible way that involves almost losing someone before the lesson lands. The log I kept for 3 years was preparation. The rescue was the moment. What came after was the actual change, gradual and imperfect and real. Changed people don't announce themselves. They ask different questions, show up to different events, tell different stories. Daniel tells mine now. That's the thing I didn't expect and still don't entirely know what to do with. He tells it better than I do because he has the credibility of being the person who was in the compound. He's not wrong to tell it. The story is real and it matters, and if it changes how one person thinks about intelligence work or about the colleagues they dismiss or the siblings they reduce to supporting characters in their own narratives, then the story being told is more useful than my silence would be. I just keep writing things down. It's what I know how to do. Write it down. That is the whole instruction. Everything else follows from that, every single time, without exception.